Brilliant. So welcome everybody to our personal development session on careers today. I'm Jenny Pelling and I'm the Director for Apprenticeship Development and Diversity. And we've been running these personal development seminars on a range of subjects. And I'm really thrilled to see some familiar names and faces with us today, and some of our Kaplan Apprenticeship Advisory panel as well in the list. So welcome to everybody. We're joined today by Miranda Smythe, who some of you know. She's our expert personal development tutor. And Miranda is going to be taking us through the topic of enriching your career. And we're looking at particular careers and appraisals and one-to-ones. So I shall hand over to Miranda. There will be opportunities for questions at the end, but we're quite informal as a discussion group. If you've joined earlier and you heard the conversation on leadership and chickens, you'll know that. So do feel free to join in with comments or questions at any point. Thank you. Over to you, Miranda.
Thanks, Jenny. And I would like to make it as participative as possible in the short time we have available to us. Make free use of the chat particularly. It's fantastic. What we can do is we can pick things up from there as well. So officially welcome to today's session. As Jenny mentioned, it's called Enriching Your Role. I think it's really interesting. A lot of the studying you'll be doing with Kaplan will be sort of fairly technical in nature, but this is so lovely today because this is really about you. It's about thinking about what you want from your career, what you want from your working life. So as I mentioned, I will be asking questions from time to time, so feel free to pop things into chat. But the whole idea behind our lunchtime session today is looking for ways for you to add value to what you do, working out for you what career means and what you actually want from your career, but also maybe thinking about the future and where you go from here. So there are 4 different things that we're going to be covering, areas we're going to be covering during our session. The first thing is just talking a little bit about career aspirations and understanding a little bit more about your drivers, what motivates you and what you're looking for at this moment in time. The second point, which I think will be really useful for people who are in a role, and there is a natural at the moment a next step to that, is ideas around keeping personal motivation levels high. Then we're going to explore ways of developing the skill set within the role that you have at this moment in time. And finally, as Jenny mentioned, and really importantly, ways of getting the best from appraisals and also one-to-one. So that's what we've got planned. Any aspirations you have for the session, that would be really lovely if you pop those in the chat box. Particularly interested in what sounds most useful from your point of view, what you want to gain from our session today. So our starting point is really defining this word that gets bandied around quite a bit. And what I wanted to know from you, and again, if we can use the chat box to do this, that would work perfectly, is if I say the word career, what does it mean to you? Could you just throw literally your reaction to the word career into the chat box? What does career mean to you? Let's have a look and see what we've got. Oh, wow, fulfillment, job, future goals, that's interesting. Long term, your end goal opportunities, a job for life. Service is what I do contribute to the world, making a living out of. It's really interesting because one of the things that you might notice, they're not exactly the same. Got path of development. Ella talks about doing something you love. Somebody once famous said, if you find a job you love, you never have to work a day of your life. And I really love that idea. Job, way of making money, career, your role. So we all have a different idea of what career means to us. And I think traditionally, however people sort of interpret the word career, there being sort of a traditional idea of career as being like a ladder, that it's very much a sequential pathway, that you do this and you do that, then you do this and this happens and then this happens. One of the things that's really interesting, and there's some interesting material on the Kaplan microsite as well in the career development section, is more and more people now are tending to talk about a squiggly career. This comes from Helen Tupper and Sarah Ellis, who developed this idea that career isn't necessarily nowadays working from one step, sort of very sort of laterally to the next, that careers can take on many different shapes. And there's no one pattern of doing it. And what works for one person necessarily doesn't work for others. And it's sometimes the idea that people may move sideways to move in a different direction, or sideways sometimes to move into a more senior role. Sometimes people in the more senior role, and they choose to work in a more junior level, that there are no rules. It's about making it work for you. In general terms though, however you think about career, whatever it means to you, there are usually three elements that really need to come together to make it balanced. Let me just explain this in a bit more detail. So when you think about an idea career for you, I'm always guessing that it's got these three elements associated with it. Skills are things that you develop. You might be born with some inherent skills, but essentially these are things that you develop. So a lot of the capital learning you're doing, part of your apprenticeship, this is developing your skills. Your talent is something that's inherent within you. It's something that's born in, that can be encouraged, can be coached, can be enhanced, can continue to grow throughout our life. And purpose is basically about having a sense of what you're doing is valuable, that there's meaning in it. And it's often said that the perfect career for us is when these three things come together in the right way. So you're using skills that are useful to the organization and developing your skills too. You're able to use your natural talent set, but also you're working in an environment where you've actually got a belief in your work and what you're doing. Just as an example of this, I don't know if any of you heard of the cellist Jacqueline Dupre. She actually died when she was quite young, but if you haven't heard of her, Elgar Cello Concerto is something definitely that should be on your list to listen to. Had a huge talent, major skills, held up often as being the cello player of all time. But at one stage, she hated touring so much and being away from home so much. She left her cello out in the snow for it to warp, so she wouldn't have to play it. And there's an example of somebody who's developed their skills, has a real talent and a passion for something, but that purpose just felt lacking. So whatever you do, it's about ending up in an environment where it really suits you. Now, what's intriguing about this is, as you mentioned in the chat, career isn't something that's static. It is something that evolves and develops. And I'm just wondering, did any of you have an opportunity to have a look at the orientations indicator that we sent out before today? If so, please could you put your hand up on the screen, either virtually or physically? Did anybody have a chance to have a look at the quiz? Oh, lovely. Some of you did. If you haven't had a chance to have a look at it, then I'd really recommend that you do after today. It's one of those little indicators that's a little bit fussy to answer, but gives you really valuable information about yourself and what's important to you. It kind of packages probably what you already know, but maybe does it in a slightly different way. So for those of you who've actually completed the questionnaire, and those of you who've got it on your list of things to do, I just wanted to go through some of the key findings from it to give you a little bit of a feel of the sorts of things that can be really important in career motivators. This is about understanding that we all have an individual career orientation. We'll speak a little bit about how this can shift and change as we evolve and develop after we've run through this. But there are 5 different drivers that you will relate to in one degree or another. What I do is I walk you through this, so you've actually had a lot of chance to look at this. Perhaps be interesting if you comment on your findings, if you feel comfortable to do so in the chat.
Rhonda, I wonder if there might be something covering your microphone. It's just gone a bit faint.
Or has it? I do apologise.
Oh, that's better. That's better.
That's better. Oh,
yeah,
lovely. Thanks, Jenny. So the first career orientation is advancement. If you scored highly, or if immediately I talk about this, it resonates with you, then this is something that's going to be quite a driver for you at this moment in time. It might change, it might not, but this is for somebody who's seeking to be at a point of influence, who's looking to make an impact, who's really after visibility, and might have an eye on the next stage of their development, their progression, their advancement. So if this is one of the important drivers for you, this will tell you that this is what you should be looking for at some stage, is opportunities to advance, to be visible, maybe to work even at a more senior or in more niche area of your career. The second orientation is security. Security is important to many of us. It's often something about being in an environment that is really familiar to us. There's a certain almost comfort sometimes of traveling the same way each way, seeing the same faces each day. And people are motivated by security, tremendously loyal to their organization, but expect their organization to be loyal back to them. Really value symbols of appreciation, and again that needs to work both ways. And people who really motivated by security sometimes might stay with the same organization for a period of time. And it's so interesting that sometimes, somebody who has advancement as their dominant characteristic may be prepared to sacrifice security in the short term. It's really interesting how these interlace together. The next orientation is challenge. So see if you relate to this. It'd be lovely to hear from you in the chat if you're comfortable to do so, which ones of these you relate to the most. Challenge is not necessarily about somebody being very loud and extroverted, but it's more about working in cutting edge work, doing things that are different, doing things that are new, maybe experimenting, trying different things on for fit. And somebody who's really driven by challenge might find if they're in an environment where that doesn't allow that, the environment doesn't facilitate that, they might find it quite difficult to remain motivated, particularly if there aren't things outside work that may be giving that individual those fulfillments. But challenge is really about challenge. It's about learning, it's about doing things new, it's about things that are different. You'll know if you're motivated by challenge that sometimes you might not always want to repeat things. Sometimes people who are motivated by challenge don't always like some of the repetitive nature of some roles. So that's the challenge element. We've got individuals who are really driven by the idea that they can maintain control over their work. I think working from home over the last couple of years, for those of you who've been with us for the last 24 months might relate to this. People who loved the freedom of being able to organize the work that they wanted in the order that they wanted it to do, really have that sort of sense of freedom. There's a little bit of a theory as well that says people who are really, this is for whom freedom is a really important characteristic, may end up being their own boss. Although I think sometimes you have to be a little bit careful about freelance work because you can end up with 63 bosses rather than just having one, but having that maximum control over their own work. And then finally, and really important, balance. This is about an individual who finds it really important to achieve that delicate balance between how much time they spend at work and the effort and energy put in at work, then their external relationships, but also self-development. And as I say, it's a little bit of a balancing act. It's not 33, 33, 33. It's individuals who are really keen to find a balance between what they do that's meaningful at work, their personal relationships, but also their personal development. So just wondering if we just stop at this moment, whether we could have some feedback on this, if people are happy to share. Really interested in what resonated you as part of this. So feel free to pop things in the chat and I'll pick them up from there. But which of these do you think describes you at this moment in time? Oh, lovely. Emma's talked about challenge, balance coming through. Again, balance again. Freedom, advancement, challenge and freedom. Isn't it interesting how we're all so different? Lots of balance coming through, some challenge, security. A huge range of different things. Thank you so much for sharing this. It's really lovely to see these coming through. And it's interesting how many of you have picked up, it's not just one thing, it's maybe a blend of different orientations that are important too. In fact, Louise, I think, has picked out 3, which is really intriguing. So if you haven't done the indicator, perhaps have a look at it after today. It'd be really interesting if it on paper says what you said into the to the session itself. But one thing that I thought was really worth knowing about in looking at these career orientations is that there are a few caveats that associate with this. Let me just explain what I mean by this. These are the orientations that we were just looking at. But it's really useful to be aware of that, as some of you have demonstrated, you know, a lot of us have a variety of different drivers. It's not one thing, it's a little bit of a mix of these. So you might have had a drive that feels more important to you, but there might be some other secondary orientations as well that you relate to. But your orientation can change, it can shift. Again, it'd be really interesting to hear from you in the chat box what sort of things you think might influence a person's orientation. I'll give you an example if that helps. Years ago, I had a friend and it was all about ambition and challenge. And then her life circumstance changed and all of a sudden it was about security and balance. So things can change very, very quickly. So it's important not to maybe put yourself in a nice little box and say this is what's important to me, because it can change. And as I mentioned, it can be influenced by things that happen to us in life, or even a change of circumstance. For example, if somebody's in an environment where there isn't much security can become more important temporarily within that situation. There's something also really important that I wanted to mention as well, and that is your orientation isn't wrong, it belongs to you. And I think it could be really comfortable if somebody describes themselves as having security as a really important driver, as a really important motivator, but they work in an environment where other people maybe are more about advancement. It can feel wrong sometimes to have that orientation, and it's never wrong, it belongs to you. What you really do need to do, though, is to be honest about with yourself about what's important. And just finally, if you didn't relate to many of those different areas that I showed you, those 5 descriptive terms a moment ago, it may be that you haven't got strong orientation, maybe a little bit mix of all of them. That's not wrong either. Some people never develop a strong orientation. They go with the flow. They're very fluid and they're very flexible. There are huge advantages to doing that. So if you didn't immediately have one of those different orientations resonate with you, it's really not an issue. Just some people never develop a strong orientation. So that's just a little bit about thinking more about career, what it means. The idea that career isn't necessarily something that is linear, that's like a ladder, that careers can go in a lot of different ways. They can be squiggly too, and it's important to recognise that some people also talk about portfolio careers now, where somebody gets their income from a variety of different sources. The traditional routes are no longer held up to be the only way of doing things. But without a doubt, in terms of managing your career, things like appraisals and one-to-ones can be tremendously important, because they're spaces that get created between you and your line manager. There are opportunities for you to promote what you do, maybe to talk about any barriers or trickiness, and look at ways of wiggling your way again around those. And what we're going to do is to move from talking about career orientations into exploring a little bit more about how we can make use of appraisals and one-to-one. We've been asked if we can reshare the link for the quiz, and I'll get Jenny on the case to do that after our session today. But it'd be really lovely if you haven't had an opportunity to do that, just as a way of really affirming some of these thoughts you've had about that immediately today. So as mentioned, what we're going to do now is to talk a little bit about appraisal. And I've got a little bit of a case study here that I'd like to show you. So I'm going to pop this on the screen, and I'd love your feedback. So again, if you're happy to use the chat to do this, have a look at this scenario. I'd love you to know what advice you'd give. So you've got a colleague, been doing the same role for a while, does the job well, wants to stay with the company. But over coffee, she says she's feeling a bit unchallenged and feeling that the role is a bit samey, it's a bit repetitive. And she's got her appraisal meeting next week. And I'm just wondering, what advice would you give her? And immediately Janelle says, advise her to talk to a manager. Joyce says she needs to be really honest. Sarah mentions about working towards something bigger. A lot of comments coming through about honesty, which is really interesting and lovely to hear. Got a suggestion about looking at a different role, or maybe talking about promotion. Again, lots of honesty coming through here, sharing her feelings with a manager. Love that comment about working out a way to incorporate her own aspirations with the goals of the organisation. Tanya as well, that's interesting, about whether she knows what she'd like to do or open to anything new. Some really good advice and guidance here. You just talked about setting objectives. Oh, Sarah, we're going to come on to this about creating a list of things that she's done well. Isn't it interesting how people often forget their achievements? So that's lovely to see coming through there. Any other thoughts? This has just made a really astute comment that it depends on the relationship that she has with her line manager. And I think in terms of appraisal, that's very, very, very true. I think most of us probably, if you think back about your working history, you'll have had some managers that you feel comfortable to share a lot with, and other managers where you've been a little bit more gatekeeping in terms of what you share. Comment about change process 2 coming through. I'd like to know what that relates to, so do pop a little bit extra in that. Comparing how she's achieved these goals and objectives. Well done. Lots of really good quality advice. And I think, you know, for many of us, and this is particularly true if you're in an environment or you're in a particular role at the moment where there is no logical next step, where maybe at the moment either you're consolidating because some of you studying as well as working and running homes, and that's quite a balancing act in its own right. But for many of us, if there isn't that natural next step, it can feel easy to run out a little bit of steam. So one of the things I wanted to do is to run through some ideas and suggestions on how you can keep your energy levels high in the workplace. So let's just have a little bit of a look at these. This actually relates to some of the comments that were helpfully popped in the chat just now. In terms of keeping your personal motivation high, I think one of the things people forget is how much they've learned and developed. Development happens very incrementally. So one of the things that will have happened, and certainly since you've been studying with Kaplan, you may not have noticed it. You get this skills creep whereby you're developing a lot of skills, behaviours, developing a lot of knowledge, but not really recognising how far you've come. So if you haven't done this for a while, it's a really useful activity just to remind you how far you've come. And then once you've got this idea, this sort of skills map of what you've developed and the skills that you have, maybe also challenge yourself to potentially look at the gaps. And I'll give you an example of this. Say, for example, you've got the mindset that your next natural role for you will be doing a senior role or a supervisory role. One of the things that you can do as part of your skills assessment is to look at the skills that you've got, think about the skills that you need to be working at that level, and work out what the gaps are, and see if there are any ways of building some of that skills gap into what you're doing at this moment in time. See if there are opportunities maybe to develop some of those skills that would naturally help you be in a better place when you achieve that next role. Later on to you, for you today, I've mentioned a kind of resources list, and I have included a book by a chap called Dale Carnegie. I don't know if you've ever heard of Dale Carnegie, but the book I'm going to recommend to you is How to Win Friends and Influence People. The reason I'm mentioning that book is that Dale Carnegie was stuck in a job that he described as being very mundane and repetitive. And the way that he kept himself energized was continually setting himself new targets. So not necessarily just doing things fast, but doing things better. So looking at the quality of what he did, seeing if he could produce better quantity of work without dropping the quality. So if there's no natural next step for you at this moment in time, see if you can enrich what you do by looking at the quality of what you do, or maybe sometimes your output. Just be aware that there is a relationship between quality and quantity. Another idea is to make sure that you garner all the feedback that you can. I think you have to be careful about this because this could be a little bit overdone. But going to individuals who see enough of you to be able to comment really meaningfully on what you do and how you go about doing it. But look at opportunities to gather feedback from others. We will talk about feedback because sometimes it's tricky to manage. Sometimes it can come out of nowhere and can sort of sidesweep us almost. But use opportunities to gather feedback from others. Really pay attention to the feedback that you get. So if people say you're doing something really well, do more of it. If people say it's not working, then change it. So really pay attention to that. And also, I don't know if you have a mentor. If you don't, it's a really good idea. Some organisations often have formal mentor schemes, or sometimes informal ones. But if you're in an organisation where there isn't a mentor scheme, what's the harm in approaching somebody and asking them if they'll mentor you? It's not usually your line manager. Doesn't necessarily have to be somebody who's senior, but often it is because of the vista that they have across an organisation. It could be somebody external as well. So get yourself a mentor. Really useful. You can bounce things off them, get feedback from them. They can set you challenges too. Now, those of you who are feeling overwhelmed at this moment in time, this probably isn't a great strategy, but volunteering for project groups and working parties is a really good way of building your profile across an organisation, building your network, but also learning some new skills. What skills you need in your work isn't necessarily always what you need in project groups, so it's a lovely opportunity for enriching your role without changing your role. As some of you suggested in our past example, Rashida probably should be honest with the manager, ask for more responsibility or ask for more diversity in their work. And again, your manager won't automatically know this. If you don't say something, they won't immediately be aware of it. So I loved your idea, be really honest. And this last idea, which might not work for all of us, is if you've got a skill that you've got outside work, are there relevant opportunities to use it in your workplace? And just a really immediate example of this is somebody that I know was a really talented photographer, was feeling a little bit jaded in the role that they did, and appraisal was really honest, and now is taking all of the photographs, or was taking all of the photographs for the staff newsletter and magazine. So really enjoying that part of the job, and it's sort of subsidizing the other bits. So that might not feel quite so relevant for you, but for many of us, if you do have a skill, is it possible to cross-reference it into your workplace? Now, some of you suggested that Rashida really should make best use of her appraisal with her line manager, that she should be really honest. So one of the things I thought we'd do is to talk a little bit about appraisal and one-to-ones. And as part of this, also to mention feedback. So hands up those of you who are involved in appraisals. You can either do this virtually or you can raise your hand physically on the screen. Do you have appraisals? Jenny does, yeah. One-to-ones? Yeah, fantastic. I can see that a lot of you do. That's super. Quite a lot of people in the room. More people raise their hands than haven't. Some of you don't have appraisals, which is quite interesting because it's quite rare, I think, nowadays to find an organisation that doesn't have some sort of structure in place, whether it's performance review or appraisal, packaged by just a different name. So one of the things I thought we'd run through, just some tips and techniques around gaining the best out of appraisals and one-to-one. And we're doing this because they can be a really important part of your development. It's an opportunity for some reflective practice, for some feedback, for some objective setting too. So in terms of managing your career and enriching what you're doing at the moment, I'd say if you do have an appraisal or a one-to-one process, you should really be maximising that. Now, just a few tips and techniques, and then we'll talk about feedback. First things first, your manager will have prepared for your discussion. You should prepare too. Sometimes you might get a formal document to work your way through, which asks you for a little bit of reflection on the last period of time. But when you prepare thoroughly, think about the whole period of time. Just don't go back to the most recent incident. Think about the whole period of time that's covered by that appraisal or one-to-one. Use it as an opportunity for a bit of reflective practice in terms of what's worked really well versus what didn't, and what changes you would like to make. It's really important also, by way of preparing, that you talk about your achievements, and a lot of us are really poor at doing this. It's like that strengths and weakness questions at recruitment, isn't it? A lot of people immediately go into their weaknesses and don't talk about their strengths. And I don't know, have you heard this idea of keeping a strawberry file? It's not a bad idea, and that is, you get a feedback from a, piece of feedback from a stakeholder in an email thanking you for doing something or praising you for a piece of work. Keep it, take it to your appraisal with you. I don't really want to concentrate on the pay link, but some appraisal schemes are pay linked, so you really do need to make a case for your performance. So be prepared to talk about things that have worked really, really well that you're proud of. Also, though, talk about things that you could have done differently. And I think in an appraisal setting, it's really lovely almost to get in first. So instead of your manager having to pick on something that wasn't the greatest, there's an opportunity for you to raise that. Then you shape the way that you talk about that. So you can identify what you could have done differently and how you do it differently in future. And also to draft ideas for your objectives. Objectives are negotiable, or they should be negotiable. So it's a good idea to go to the meeting prepared with some objectives. And this is where I think some of you said Rashida could do a good job by going and thinking about what her priorities could be for the next period. Linked to your objectives is what learning and development you need to support that. Your learning and development really should be lined up to your objectives. So if you've got 4 objectives that you're going to propose, then you need to think about what learning and development might need to support that. Actually, sometimes it might not be that you need to learn something or be trained in something. Sometimes it might need that you need a different level of support. So again, be prepared to ask. Generally ask questions, listen actively. We'll talk about feedback and listening in just a moment. It's really important that you participate fully in the discussion itself. It's, this meeting is for you, it's about you, it's for your benefit. So make sure that you participate fully in it. And again, because we associate with appraisals and one-to-one with feedback, perhaps just get yourself in the right mindset for managing feedback. So what we're going to do now is we're going to then move on to looking at ways of actually managing feedback, which could be about praise, or it could be about criticism, which is about doing something differently. And again, if you've got any thoughts on how, tips and techniques on managing feedback, that would be lovely to see those appear in the chat. Because whilst you're doing that, I just wanted to mention something to you, which doesn't necessarily have to be the reality, but it's called SARA, and I don't know if you've seen it before, but it's sometimes the way that people react to feedback that's unexpected and sometimes unwelcome because it's different, but it's feedback that comes a little bit sideways. So in the meantime, whilst I'm showing this, if you've got any thoughts on the management of feedback, do put that into the chat box and we'll pick it up from there. So let's have a look at SARA, reactions to feedback. I'd say this doesn't have to be the case, but one of the things that can happen is people experience a different level of energy at different stages of reacting to a piece of feedback. So, for example, somebody's line manager says something and a member of staff wasn't expecting it. And we do say in appraisals there shouldn't be surprises. So we're just talking about feedback very generally at this moment in time. It can influence people's energy. So In an extreme instance, somebody might be told something and they've never heard it before. So there's a bit of critique. So somebody goes into a little bit of shock, of disbelief. I can't really believe that. Why has nobody said that before? I've never heard that. I've never been aware of that. Sometimes people have a little bit of a surprise associated with a piece of feedback. It's not unheard of. It may not be, your pattern of behavior, but sometimes if somebody gets a bit of feedback that's quite strong and the person reacts to it very strongly, you might get this emotional reaction to it, which can take the form of anger. Anger is always a secondary emotion, interestingly enough, so it could be that somebody's hurt, they're bewildered, the shock coming into play there. Sometimes there's a level of resistance. People resist the feedback, they deny it, and then again, acceptance and action. So this doesn't have to be the case at all, but it's a known reaction to unexpected feedback where somebody's surprised by it, they have an emotional reaction to it, they then deny it, find ways of resisting that feedback, followed ultimately by acceptance and action. And it's a really interesting model because it almost gives legitimacy to sometimes to the way that we react. And you'll notice levels of energy through this changing. The highest level of energy is the emotional reaction, the anger that I mentioned. The lowest is resistance, which can be quite inert, but then acceptance and action. So let's have a little bit of a look at some of the thoughts that you've had about managing feedback. Oh, these are good. Joyce says, take a breath. Don't allow the instant reaction. Oh, Samuel, again, very wise words too. Stimulus and response to space. In that space is, oh, they're not yours, you stole them, they're fabulous. Thank you, Samuel. In that space is our power to choose our response. In our response lies our growth and our freedom. Oh, I love that. Well done. Try to separate my personal self and professional self. Well done. Some really, really good thoughts in there, and a lot of them relate to what you've just seen on screen. So in terms of feedback, as I mentioned, feedback really can be classed into two distinctive groupings. One is feedback, which is about praise, which is about reward, which is about recognizing something that somebody's done really, really well. The second form of feedback, which is often called criticism, it's about change, it's about doing something differently. So you've got the praise, which is affirmatory, and then critique, which is about doing something differently. Now, it's really interesting because many people say that actually praise is harder to take than criticism. Does anybody agree with that in the room? It's often said that people find praise harder to take than criticism. Yeah, isn't that interesting? Why is it so hard to believe the good stuff? I don't know if it's we're inherently modest. Aida said about depends how they present feedback. Absolutely, the way that people give feedback, if it's done clumsily, can really impact on the way that people receive it. Absolutely, really, really clever thoughts there. So, just a few tips on the management of feedback. The first thing I want to say is with praise. You know, all of us need to learn to accept it. It's a gift. Be very careful about gifting, giving a gift back. It's really sad when, somebody says to somebody else, you did that really well. And this person says, I'm just doing my job, or it's what I'm paid to do. And it's such a shame. It's a real reward. So think about praise as being a gift. You really don't want to give a gift back. This was said in the chat, wasn't it, about listening actively, listening openly to it, not prejudging it, but let somebody talk and then drawing conclusions afterwards. And again, you may not agree with everything that's said to you in life, and not one person has the absolute rule on what's right and what's wrong. So one of the things that perhaps is really useful to do is, if you're not sure, is ask for an example. And it's a good way also of processing feedback, because it gives you a little bit of time to reflect on what's being said, a little bit of time maybe to go through some of those reactions that we spoke about. So it goes a long the lines of, or in what way, or could you give me an example of when I did that? And this is really useful if you're trying to place things in context. And there's ideas of using questions to clarify it. Sometimes people aren't always clear in the way that they give feedback. I think I did mention that about sometimes people aren't sort of skilled in giving this sort of feedback to us. So using questions to clarify, asking for examples, and just being careful how you react. More and more, I think people are talking about emotional intelligence, and intelligence comes in a number of different packages, but emotional intelligence is being able to manage our reaction to things, to see about the impact that we have on others, being able to read other people's body language and emotions too. So it's really important, and actually the management of body language and tone is really, really important. If you think about it, people who are working at an enhanced level, one of the things that they will do is they'll have control over their tone, their attitude, their body language. So it's really important that you take responsibility for managing those. Then, of course, it's time for reflecting and deciding how you act on the feedback itself. The whole idea about feedback, which is critique-based, is it's about change. It's about doing something different. And it seems a shame for somebody to go through a whole process of doing this with us and for change not to happen. So if it's something legitimate, then you really do need to be acting on it. And perhaps just remember as well, your first reaction to a piece of feedback might not be your final reaction. I won't be the only person in the room who's had somebody say to them something over the years, and I thought, no, that's not true. And I go away, and 2 weeks later, I think, maybe it is. Anybody else relate to that? First reaction might not always be your end reaction. So allow yourself time to process that and to reflect on it, and then you can draw proper conclusions. So in a moment, I'm going to pass back to Jenny. But before I do that, I mean, today we've looked at career, what it means, different career orientations, enriching ourselves in the role that we're in for this moment in time, thinking about how we can make use of appraisals and one-to-ones. I've got a book list for you. I know Jenny's got some additional resources. Actually, it's not a book list, it's a resource list. I just thought if you're seeking more inspiration after today, there's lots of stuff out there that you can plug into. But I just wanted to mention 3 things to you. Has anybody ever read this, by the way? I read it at least once a year. It's a bit dated, but there's some real lessons in there. It's called How to Win Friends and Influence People from Dale Carnegie. That's a book. It's probably an audio version of it too. The Sophie Devonshire audio book about loving work, about 7 steps to thriving. Lovely audio book, really, really positive and motivational. And thirdly, wanted to recommend to you a video which some of you might have seen called Hidden Figures. It's a story about in the 1960s about 3 African American women who were working at NASA and the way that they managed being under-recognized in their work. And it's a good film because it's true and it's really motivational, but I just thought there was some interesting learning to pull from there. But bottom line is, it's your career, you control it, you decide. So I'm now going to pass back to Jenny.
Thank you, Miranda. And what you do is you give us the opportunity and space to pause and think. So thank you. I'm going to ask on the subject of feedback for everyone to complete the quick survey for us about this session, because we build on the feedback you give us when planning our future careers and personal development seminars. So please do, because we take into account what you ask for and build it into future sessions. So please, if you could take a second to do that now, that'd be fab. We'll send out the recording afterwards and the questionnaire that Miranda mentioned. There are just 1 or 2 other things on the final slide, if Miranda would be able to share that. Just wanted to flag. So there is a really good careers microsite that we have that Miranda's got the link to there, and that will be in the slides when you get those in the next couple of days. Do have a dabble. There are so many things there around career solutions, different sectors, discussions around squiggly careers, as Miranda's just said. So have a dabble. The National Careers Service and the phone numbers there, they run some free coaching, careers coaching as well. So you have the opportunity to ring them, whether you're an apprentice or not an apprentice, and have a coaching session with them. And then the Amazing If podcast is a great listen, and I'd highly recommend doing that. And then finally, we can come off the screen, the slide. We've got our next careers seminar session is on the 15th of June. So do join us for that one. We're going to be joined by a former apprentice, a tutor, and somebody from the ICAEW talking about ranges of careers and different sectors. So that's the next one in our personal development careers list. And that just leaves me with 1 minute to spare to thank you all so much for joining us both today and taking part, and for your contributions as ever in the chat. It's been really lovely having you with us, and I hope you found it a valuable 45 minutes. We look forward to seeing you again soon. Bye bye, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you all so much. Take care. Best wishes.